Hey girl, Marissa here. You are listening to the Codependent Dummy podcast. As a young woman, you have been raised, reinforced, and rewarded for putting the needs of others above your own. Now, in your 20s, you're finding yourself exhausted, exasperated, and enveloped in shit relationships, especially the one you have with yourself. Codependency is a way of being where we put the feelings, wants, and needs of others above our own in an unconscious attempt to meet our own feelings, wants, and needs. Sorry to break it to you, sis, but that is not sustainable. This podcast is to help you undo all that so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. Let's get to it. Oh, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Codependency podcast. Today, I'm sitting with Lacey Morris. Lacey is a licensed marriage and family therapist from Calabasas, California. One of Lacey's passions and specialties is helping others break patterns of codependency and find a secure bond within themselves. This changes one from the inside out and helps one finally find true freedom and joy. Lacey, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here.
All right, well, let's start with the typical two. So first and foremost, Lacey, how do you define codependency?
Well, it's a good question. I know it comes up a lot and people are always kind of curious, like, what does that mean? Am I codependent? But I sort of think of it as, when we have too much dependency and we abandon ourselves, right? So what is healthy kind of becomes taking care of other people's needs. Some of these traits are we feel responsible for other people's emotions. We often feel like we need approval, and sometimes it's like too much approval. So we're ultimately neglecting our own sense of self and sort of losing ourselves in this process, right? Of like caretaking or needing that approval, neglecting our own interests, and oftentimes getting like breadcrumbs, getting very little from people. And most of the time, this is just unresolved emotions, right? A lack of self-esteem. And so we need that validation and purpose through other people's problems often. Yeah.
Right. We abandon ourselves unknowingly. Yeah. Other thoughts on what that might look like or sound like in our behavior?
Well, I mean, generally, a lot of this is very unconscious because it does come mostly from our childhood. And so a lot of our needs weren't always met as children. And so, the behavior can look like losing ourselves in relationships where we're maybe getting very little. It could also be in a job, a job or a friendship where it feels very much like we need constant approval. We need that connection. We need validation. So I think it plays out in various areas of our lives where we constantly feel like we need external validation to feel a sense of wholeness in a way.
Yeah. Abandon, when we really think about it, it could be such an extreme action, right? Abandon, right? If I have a baby and I abandon my baby, it's just left. It's helpless and completely on its own, right? And so, picturing, I think for codependence, it can seem like it's not a big deal.
Sure.
Right? Like, I'm just giving my all, at work, or again, it's not conscious, but like my boyfriend, like he just really needs a lot. Like it's okay. But it is like these subtle choices turn into this big extreme action of abandoning oneself.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah.
Lacey, do you have a codependent experience or relationship from your own life that you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I think, why I specialize in this obviously is because I've had a history of sort of losing myself in codependent relationships.
Mhm.
I probably was very unconscious of it, but was in a relationship where, I just sort of lost sense of self. It was all about the other person. I was taking kind of little breadcrumbs, and it was all about me kind of healing and trying to fix this person. And that was part of the codependent sort of addiction of like, if I help this person, if I heal them, maybe one day they'll love me. And then what I was realizing is, wow, a lot of this is from my own kind of unresolved emotions from childhood. Like, I really just wanted my parents to love me, right? And there's this constant, like, okay, if I do this, then this will happen, right? Or I'll get the validation, or I'll get the love I need. So I definitely had cycles of being very addicted to people. And I guess that was for me. It felt like a love addiction, but basically being attracted and losing myself in this dynamic until one point just had this like wake up call when it ended. I was like, wow, I have to go within, right? I have to look
Mhm.
at some of these issues of why I've lost myself, right, in these relationships. So that sort of started a journey of wanting to understand codependency, what exactly was happening, and what does it mean to come back to a sense of wholeness and secure attachment within me. So I definitely feel like I've gone down that journey. It's like
Mhm.
hard path to break away from, but once you do it, you finally get to a place of like wholeness and self-love, and you don't need that external validation anymore as much as maybe you did once need, right? So
Mhm.
yeah.
Can you recall a experience in this relationship or one of your codependent relationships that is a quintessential example? Like, oh, okay, this is Lacey being codependent.
Mhm. I think what I was noticing is just simple basic needs that we desire in relationship, right? To be met, to be heard, to be loved. And I felt like even just asking for some of those and then feeling guilty about asking for my needs to be
Hmm.
met. And that was the loop cycle of like, oh my God, is this okay to ask for something? And when I would reflect back to a girlfriend or someone else, they're like, these are normal needs that should be met in relationships. People should meet you halfway, right? And so I think it was realizing that I really didn't feel worthy of being met in those ways, and then would go into this loop cycle of guilt, or okay, my needs don't matter, like brush them aside. Or so
Hmm.
I think those were the aha moments. Oftentimes getting a reflection from other people, and then being part of my own therapy process as well, of like, oh, like these are patterns that I'm unconsciously living in, and I'm ready to look at, right? That my needs do matter, and that it's okay to ask for your needs to be met, or to have these conversations with people. So that
Mhm.
was a big part of it.
I appreciate you sharing that because it's for codependence. I think, yeah, early on, I could say in my recovery, or like trying in my efforts to start to improve my relationships, I might read a book, watch some boundaries guru, or I don't know, follow some Instagram account, and they say, this is how you form an I statement. And I would take my piece of paper and I would go to, right, a boyfriend or a friend at the time, and I would I would verbalize a need like you did.
Mhm.
And I thought that that was gonna be it. But then, like you said, you were met with guilt, right? Doubting it. Oh, like you said it and you were like, is that okay? Is that okay that I said it?
Yeah.
Feeling unworthy and then not being able to uphold the request.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. There's more to it. And yeah, just being mindful, I guess, or starting to notice your patterns when you do begin to use these tools. Like it could be more involved than you think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And even though you're listening to these podcasts or you're getting help, sometimes it's so ingrained in you that it takes time to be like, oh, this is a boundary. Oh, this is okay to do, right? It's like such a new way of being in the world, right? With this new sense of self that you're discovering. So, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So referring to your passions and your specialties, Lacey, what would you say are the root causes of codependency?
I mean, I feel like generally when we sort of explore the root causes, I often help people go back to their childhood, right? So, the earliest experience of when they started, noticing some of this. And one of the most common consequences of childhood trauma is the development of codependency, right? So, oftentimes children grow up in these environments where their emotional needs are just not met. They learn to seek the validation and approval from others basically as like a means of coping, right, with their own pain, their own feelings of unworthiness. So I think this generally leads to these patterns of becoming kind of overly focused on other people's needs at the expense of their own, because that's all they watched, right? It doesn't mean it has to be both parents. It could have just been one parent, right? But it's generally just what they learn growing up, and then it becomes that kind of normal cycle of like, okay, if I focus on other people's needs, right, like I'm gonna get some kind of validation, I'm gonna get something, right? So I think it starts oftentimes at very early ages, I would say. That's the root
Mhm.
cause.
Mhm. And as we grow older, how do the root causes manifest in our adult lives?
Yeah, I mean, it can show up, I would say, in sort of a variety of ways. It could be in romantic relationships, it could be in friendships, it could even be in kind of family dynamics, right? So I think just noticing, okay, within these dynamics, people may struggle with like setting boundaries, right? Like we talked about earlier. What are your own needs? What are your desires, right? And then there's always that deep seated fear of like rejection, abandonment, which kind of leads them to avoid conflict, right? And so they're sacrificing their own well-being to maintain these sort of dysfunctional relationships, right? So I think that
Mhm.
happens. And then when you see it in romantic relationships, it, manifests as a pattern of sort of staying in very unhealthy relationships, tolerating maybe abusive behavior, just in kind of avoiding being alone. It's similar to friendships. It could be a constant seeking approval or validation from others. And it comes back to that like cost of one's well-being, right? Like, okay, I'll still be in this dynamic because I don't want to lose this person, but that it's like taking the breadcrumbs again or not getting your needs met. Um,
Mhm.
I think in family situations, it could be maybe you were the caretaker or the mediator, right, to avoid conflict. So then there's like a fear of like, oh, if I finally heal this codependency, what is that going to look like in my family? So it can bring up again like feelings of sadness or guilt, or I don't want to let my parent down because maybe
Right.
that played a role in their family too. So it's so complex, but it like plays out in all these areas. So, yeah.
Mhm. And I'm curious, what have you seen or observed long term if these patterns go unaddressed?
If they go unaddressed, I've seen people just get very depleted. Oftentimes people get illnesses or they're depressed. They're just not generally happy in their work environment or their relationships. There's a sense of kind of waiting for the shoe to drop, or maybe there's moments of, okay, I'm good, like a little bit of denial, and then the reality hits and they're really not happy. So there's definitely, it can be a lot of like roller coaster ups and downs.
Mm.
But oftentimes fear of, okay, I don't know how to make a change because this is all I've ever known. And
Right.
oftentimes these people are the most caring, loving, nurturing people, right? But there's a fear of like, if I put a boundary, I'm going to be mean or it's going to change my personality. And so it's interesting to see that, I think I think going back to boundaries, if we didn't grow up with boundaries, we don't really know what they are, and they can seem scary or, kind of strict or severe. And so I remember I read something, I think it was the Dalai Lama said that like the kindest people have the strongest boundaries or something.
Mm.
And I was like,
Wow.
interesting, because a lot of times people that are codependent don't understand boundaries, but they generally are like the kindest people, right? So I think you could see that trying to understand what that looks like for them is important too, but they get lost in that definition of what a boundary is, right?
Mhm.
So
The kindest people have the strongest boundaries.
yeah, I
Yeah.
thought that was interesting too. And I thought, so generally it's like, okay, that means they love themselves that much that they're gonna say, I'm sorry, this doesn't work for me, or there's a sense of self where they're really secure within themselves that they can say no and they can walk away from unhealthy situations, right?
Hmm. So
So
I sense within that statement, it's potentially challenging what a codependent, how they conceptualize kindness,
mhm.
right?
Right.
Kindness is saying yes, being available,
Hmm.
self sacrifice,
Yeah.
always helping. And the Dalai Lama is like, yeah, also kindness can be, like you said, right? Self kindness and
Hmm.
being able to, it actually is kind to say, no, I can't help with that because it's honest. If you can't help, you can't, right? There's integrity, you're aligned with yourself.
Right.
And, talking about the long term consequences, you said depleted, depressed, right? Roller coaster. If I am saying yes and helping when I don't want to, I, I'm maybe helping out. Maybe I'm driving someone to the airport. That's like a big thing in my family. And if I'm picking up my dad and I don't actually want to pick him up, maybe he's sharing a story and I'm like, that's I don't know, maybe I'll just be more opinionated, maybe I'll be a crappier driver, like the action might be what I think is kind, but I might not be kind while I'm doing it,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes
So
sense.
yeah, reconceptualizing how we, yeah, define kind.
Hmm. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on yeah, the long term consequences of these root causes continuing to manifest in our lives?
I mean, generally it's, a lot of people pleasing, and it's easy to fall into that role. And so when you are codependent, you can kind of hide behind it. You can lose yourself in these dynamics, right? So I think that's a consequence too of never really looking at your stuff. You're constantly kind of helping other people, chasing other people's problems, being there for other people. So I think that's a huge consequence of the lack of let me go within and try to understand why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, which again goes back to like the depletion or frustration or the guilt cycle too.
Mm-hmm. Disease.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That sounds awful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. PSA, all the listeners. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you, right, you do help people find a secure bond within themselves.
Hmm.
So I want to hear your approach to that. But first, what does it mean to have an insecure bond within oneself?
So, there are different attachment styles, and one of them is insecure attachment. And so, ultimately the root cause of that is, watching, there's studies on it where you kind of watch your mom when you're a very little baby, and you create your attachment styles based on generally your bond with the mother. So a lot of insecure attachment is, mom comes and goes, mom's not always very emotionally available, very present with the child. Even when the child needs to be self like soothed by the mother, maybe the mother's doing it, but it's almost like the facial expressions is like she's disconnected, she's not always there. Or mom could have a lot of anxiety herself, and so that could also be picked up from the child as well. So there's just a lot of studies on insecure attachment, from childhood. But when it is created in an adult, it creates this sense of like constantly feeling like you need reassurance or you need that validation. And when you're not getting it, it really does create this like anxiousness, this insecurity within you. It goes back to connected to some of the codependency traits of like, losing yourself in these other relationships and feeling like you're getting a sense of security and wholeness, even though it ends up being kind of a false sense of security. And it is almost like the breadcrumbs again. You're okay for a little while and you're like, oh, they do love me, right? And then it goes back into maybe they didn't return your phone call one day or something triggered you, and then you're going into that anxious cycle again of like, do they love me? Are they going to be there? So it can stir up the abandonment stuff as well. So that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
the definition in a short version of what insecure attachment might be. So yeah.
Your thoughts on, because, yeah, we've touched on attachment style. I mean, the whole podcast could be about attachment style,
Yeah.
but you're, I'm curious how might an insecure attachment with oneself look like? Or yeah, what does that internal world look like? I'm hearing, right, constantly needing reassurance from others, validation, anxiousness, other thoughts on what that's like internally.
Internally, I just think there's a lot of struggle, lack of self-love, oftentimes not really knowing what that looks like. There could be depression, sometimes suicidal thoughts. There's a lot of like highs and lows of maybe they're doing okay for a while and then they fall into not feeling okay. So I've seen different kind of patterns. It could be some insecure attachment, it can go to a pretty low level, and other people are like, okay, I'm learning to work with some of this anxiety. I know it comes up for me in relationships or friendships. So it's I will say that insecure attachment is the one that you can really help heal out of all of them. Some of the other ones are a little harder to work with when I've worked with people like individually. So there is hope for
Mm-hmm.
an insecure attachment to become more secure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's good news.
Can you say a little more on suicidal thoughts?
I think there's this when you're insecure, you oftentimes didn't feel loved as a child. So it can bring in these thoughts of like, am I not worthy? Am I not loved? And when you're in a romantic relationship, there can be these extreme moments where you're like, you go into this dark place if someone's not returning your call, or you go through a breakup, or you're being triggered by an experience where you just almost have to self-soothe yourself. But I've noticed we're working with some clients where they'll go into these moments of like, I don't even want to live because the pain is so strong sometimes for those people.
Right.
Just didn't feel like they were validated or loved as a child. So it can go into those places, especially when you're breaking the codependent cycle. I've noticed people go into very dark places of like, wait a minute, like I've lost myself in all these other relationships. Now I gotta look at some of these wounds that I've been not wanting to look at, right? So
Mhm.
it can be hard and scary initially.
Yeah. I have observed the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really breaking codependent patterns with family and this sense of unworthiness. Yeah, questioning my purpose as
Mm-hmm.
a consequence. And then, yeah, in this in between of being codependent, breaking the cycles and cultivating new ones.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just while that transition is happening, yeah, my patients will come and yeah, I don't know why I'm here. I'm having thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
I'm lost. I question whether I deserve to live. So yeah, with families and then friendships. Yeah, same thing. Like when friendships, they're either changing or ending.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
patients, engaging in self-harm
Mm-hmm.
or yeah, having suicidal thoughts. And yeah, definitely I feel like um I don't know, it's more people tend to fall apart after breakups in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, after breakups, also mentioning, yeah, really just going to these dark places.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So yeah, going back to an insecure bond with oneself. Yeah, it makes sense that you potentially might have suicidal thoughts when your external relationships aren't going well, your internal one isn't going well either.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Definitely. It just shakes you up, and because you don't have that strong sense of self, that's why it just stirs up like, who am I without this attachment, right? And what does that even look like? So
Mhm. So, yeah, the internal aspect of an insecure attachment, you said struggle, lack of self love, suicidal thoughts, highs and lows. Any other insights on the internal experience of an insecure bond with oneself?
I think I would say that that's most of it. Like, I agree with what you said earlier. I think oftentimes finding their sense of purpose in the world when they're breaking the insecure attachment. Because oftentimes when you are insecure, you are losing yourself in other areas and trying to find what is wholeness, right? But it's more external or giving yourself to other people. So I think that that can be the conflict too of like, how do I feel secure? And that could look like losing themselves in relationships or addiction problems, or just getting lost in that those insecure thoughts. So
Mhm. And what does it look like to have a secure bond within oneself?
So I think once you arrive to a place of sense of security, you don't constantly need like the external validation from others, right? You're able to still empathize with others and have empathy, but you don't feel like you have to fix someone or save someone in order to maintain any type of relationship, right? You also have a higher level of self-esteem, so you're willing to say no when things don't work and have healthy boundaries. And there's like, going back to kind of what the Dalai Lama said, you're a lot kinder, but you could say no when you need to. And, you don't lose yourself in these kind of dynamics, whether it's a work experience or a romantic relationship. Um, you don't derive meaning and fulfillment constantly out of your relationships anymore, because you have your own sense of fulfillment and meaning within yourself. So it's very much
Mm.
like going into this new kind of grounded, secure place within yourself. um, and you're able to maintain, like, long-term relationships. There's not those kind of highs and lows anymore. Oftentimes people that become secure from being insecure, as they start attracting new new relationships, new dynamics. Some of those old relationships just don't serve anymore. And so I've noticed that too, working with people, of like, oh, like now, this relationship fall away because they're not they're not playing out that same kind of dynamic anymore. So that can happen. um yeah, and they don't always feel upset if things need to be discussed or talked about. So there's also this sense of like, we can talk about, feelings, and but also just have discernment around, what their part is versus what other people's stuff is. So that probably goes back to
Mhm.
boundaries too. So, yeah.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? Like in contrast to, we talked about the long-term consequences of being codependent.
Mhm.
And right here is the lack, a secure bond, I'm hearing, is the lack of all of these codependent characteristics, right? You're saying like no need for external validation, right? Saying no, having boundaries, like with clarity,
Mhm.
higher self-esteem, your own fulfillment and meaning, right? It's very internal.
Great.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Um, your thoughts on what that might look like, sound like, feel like internally?
I think internally it's almost like people arrive to a new way of living and being. There's a lot of peace there. I think when you're in an insecure attachment, it's not always very peaceful. So once you go into a place of secure attachment, you're not in those kind of roller coaster dynamics anymore. You're not constantly over giving of yourself. So it feels like people are more stable, more grounded, more emotionally regulated. Sometimes that changes the direction of their path or their career, or oftentimes it changes their relationship. So they do find themselves in feeling more whole overall in all their relationships. And it could change the family system and family dynamics, because they're finally standing up for themselves, or they're finding that, like, okay, I just have to have stricter boundaries in mom, or you know what, maybe I can't have a relationship with my mother anymore because she's not understanding this new way of being. So it definitely changes things as well, but for the
Mhm.
good. So yeah. Oh.
And this rootedness, right? Your experience going back to when you verbalized a boundary, here comes the guilt and doubt. And so, right, the secure bond internally, recognizing a need, willing to verbalize the need, prepared for the consequences of verbalizing said need, and right, sensing like the necessity or the the like logic of the need, just like really really rooted in that.
Yeah. I think the guilt part slowly disappears, the more people practice asking for what they need and kind of dropping into this place of secure attachment within themselves. So
Mhm.
it is a sense of feeling worthy of these desires, and and having them met, right, rather than going to a guilt place. So
Mhm. What are the initial steps you take to help your patients? Oh gosh, this really, it might be two parts. So heal from root causes and create a secure bond within themselves.
So I think the first part is really exploring and understanding where some of this came from. So a lot of times I'm working with someone, we kind of do a deeper dive on, let's talk about very early childhood and very early patterns of how you grew up and sort of what was created from there. Because I think the first step is becoming aware of where's the root cause of this? Where did it even come from, right? And I think it helps people realize, oh wow, like this is how I became who I became from my sort of environment, right? So I always say that's the first step, is like awareness to some of the root causes. And then, once you become aware of it, I think it's an intricate process. So I would say is not just like let's talk about it every week, because I don't think talk therapy does enough. So I think oftentimes I'm doing, some inner child healing. So that could be like guided imagery to let's go back to some of these painful experiences that happen and see if we could heal some of this or have a different perspective on some of this. So we'll do some of
Mm.
that, which is very much like hypnosis. And so we'll do kind of explore a little bit of childhood stuff and help heal a little bit and resolve it. And then I think the third part is like reparenting. So that's almost like parenting that little child that didn't get a lot of these needs to be met. So it's becoming almost like your own mother, your own father. Like, what can you do differently? How do you create this sense of security within you? And that seems to help people a lot when they're almost like bonding with those parts of themselves that just felt fragmented and felt like, their needs weren't being met. So I think that's the biggest part, is how do we help heal that, but also give you some tools to start creating a sense of security within you. So
Mhm.
that's the short version of that.
Yeah. And what have you seen in how that transition goes?
Initially, there's some bumps in the road because, once you start doing that, it comes up with these questions. Well, who am I without that, right? So there is this sense of like new hobbies, new skills, a new community that you're a part of. You're almost entering the world in a different way. So it is a lot of baby steps of like, okay, maybe you lost yourself in these dynamics, but now it's about healthy tools and skills of like, how do you kind of continue to nurture this new sense of, the healthy version of you. So I think it's also helping people explore what brings them joy outside of, this idea that they lost themselves in these other people's pains and stories. So I think cultivating a sense of joy within themselves and having their own practice of, okay, what does that look like day to day to practice a sense of self, feeling secure within oneself. So I think it takes some time, but once they get to that place, they're obviously a lot more happy, more joyful, more peaceful. They're not missing kind of the highs and lows of maybe some of the addictions that they had to being codependent. So, um, and the self love is probably the biggest piece, right? So they've finally come back to a sense of feeling whole and loving those parts of themselves that probably were fragmented initially.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right. So some bumps in the road.
Yeah.
Mhm. And yeah, the as I'm thinking, as I'm hearing you, the word that comes to mind is a rebirth. Because you were saying, right? New community, new hobbies, new ways of relating.
For sure.
You said entering the world in a new way. Right? Nurturing what brings what brings me joy and this wholeness. Any other thoughts on that transition stage?
I do feel like it is in a way a rebirth. And just like birth itself can be, the labor process is sometimes hard and, like, okay, am I ever gonna get there? So I think, it's a delicate dance of just having compassion and patience, and because you are really rewiring your brain to think differently, to act differently. So I always just help some of the clients that I work with just have a lot of compassion and kindness and a lot of self-care and a lot of kind of routines that help them come back to this sense of self and peace and a new, like what you said, a new way of being in the world, because it does take time, especially if you've been codependent for 40, 50 years of your life, right? Like it doesn't happen overnight to all of a sudden be secure within yourself. So it is a process for sure.
Final thoughts.
Think so. I'm just really grateful to like talk about this topic and and just kind of bring light to this area that sometimes is not always like explored and talked about. And I would say a lot of people live in these patterns and then sometimes not even aware of it. So it's so nice to just bring awareness to the topic itself.
Yeah. For a while, I just thought I was a really loyal daughter and sister, a reliable employee, and a dedicated friend. I wasn't. Yeah, I was exhausted. I say in the intro how codependency can lead you to feel exhausted, exasperated, and enveloped in shit relationships. And I mean, of course, there was love there, but really, really not aware. And thankfully, right, listening to content like this, reading books, talking to people, going to therapy, starting to recognize, oh, yeah, I just remembered some of the things my therapist would say, and I was like, that's wrong. There's something wrong with that. And they were like, what is that? Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. You think you're like the loving, caring friend, partner, employee. Well, I'm just a giver and I give a lot and that's okay. So, it's not always, we don't always realize it until sometimes we have to hit rock bottom or something happens where we wake up. So,
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lacey. And if people are curious to hear more about you, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I have a website, which is just my full name. So www.laceymorris.com. And all my info is on there. I also offer free 15-minute consultations. So you can kind of get to know me and I can hear a little bit of your story as well. And my phone number is on my website too. So that's probably the best way to reach out.
Okay. I will put links to that in the show notes. And again, thank you for coming on. Thank you, dear listeners, for being here. And we will see you all next week.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay.
Hey, girl. It's Marissa again. I'm not like a regular podcaster, I'm a cool podcaster, right? Thank you for listening and staying till the end. You can find me on Instagram at Therapy with Marissa. Email me, marissa@codependummy.com. Check out codependummy.com for more information on the show. And baby girl, a subscribe, rating, and review would be much appreciated. Till next time, I want you to remember, if you are feeling unseen, I see you. If you are feeling unheard, I hear you. And if you think that you don't matter, know that you matter to me. I want you to go out there so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. And now, the disclaimer. Girl, this is not therapy and I am not your therapist. This podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regards to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, or guests are rendering any legal, clinical, or other professional service. If you want or need a professional, please find one.